Hello, this is Robbie with the Lowdown Truth. I wanted to chime in about the Uber, Lyft versus traditional taxi cab driving. I started out driving a taxi when I was about 26. So that was about 2006. And I drove, when I first started driving, we used a CB to get our calls and a paper map. And there was no cell phones. People generally did not have a cell phone on them. There was definitely no smartphones, but even cell phones were not widely used by people. So when I first started driving cab, it was a totally different experience. And now in 2025, it is July 10th, 2025, by the way. Now I'm doing driving for Uber and Lyft. It's a completely different experience. There's some good things about it, but overall I would say it's a negative change. So I drove taxi for about 7 years in Eugene, Oregon, and a little bit in Portland, Oregon. I drove for the biggest companies in Eugene, Oregon, and I drove nights for about 2.5 years, maybe 3 years, and then the rest I drove days. I drove mostly in 2009 through 2013, and then the last time I drove a real taxi was in 2018. And I started driving Uber and Lyft taxi service this year in 2025. And I've been doing it for a couple months. Even though I've been doing the food delivery for about 10 months with six different apps, or 5 different apps, and then Lyft is 6. So that's the rundown of my experience and time frame. So I would say, as for making money, you do make more money driving with Uber and Lyft than you do generally with a taxi service. When I used to drive taxi, I had to do 12-hour shifts, and I used to rent the cab out for $125 every day or every night, and then you had to pay for gas and then to wash it and vacuum it. So by the time you're done with all your expenses, you have to make $160 just to pay for that. So you could imagine in a 12-hour shift, how many rides can you actually do and how much money can you actually make. For the bulk of my time, I made an average of $8 an hour. That's gross. And that was below the minimum wage at that time. And I never did pay taxes on it either. If I did, I wouldn't have made anything. I mean, it would have been like robbery, and I worked it hard. I wasn't the best networker like drumming up business and getting personals, and I wasn't the best at doing that, but when I worked, I was on the whole time picking up people. I wasn't slacking off. So, most of the time. So, it's at this point, working Uber and Lyft, you can average more like $25 to $30. But, there is the expense of your own car, your gas, maintenance, repair, or if you're going to rent a car, to rent the vehicle. But nothing, I think the expense of your own car, even though people make a lot of that, is not nearly as much as what you would pay to rent a taxi cab for 12 hours. If you add up the amount that I paid to rent the cab, I used to work, say I worked 6 nights a week for a year. You're looking at like $25,000 a year. You could buy a new car every year, brand new, for what I was paying with the rent for the taxi. So, there are some advantages that you can't really argue with Uber and Lyft, and that's one of them. And the other part about it, it's really nice. I guess there's 2 other things that are really nice about Uber and Lyft is you don't have to work 12 hours. You can work as many hours as you want and still make a profit. So you can work 5 hours, 1 hour. You don't have to work a 12-hour shift and lease that taxi. Now, taxi drivers would eventually, they would try to own their own vehicle. Like in New York City, they spend $1 million and got their medallion, and that meant that they could roll in their own vehicle, 24 hours a day, as much as they wanted, and not pay a lease. So, eventually that's where you would get to as a cab driver, and then you would make a lot of money that way. After you get to that point, then you're working you're probably going to make, comparable to a professional job anywhere else. I don't really know what figure you want to put on it, but you can make a lot of money at that point. So there was that. That's not the case with Uber and Lyft. There is no way to improve your income. It's actually probably going to get worse and worse as time goes on, because they pretty much have taken over the market and destroyed all the taxi cab companies. Independent, privately owned taxi companies are out of business because of the unfair advantage that Uber and Lyft have over them, mostly to do with insurance and not having to get a taxi license and an airport, tags and licenses. So they're, the powers to be have given Uber and Lyft the unfair advantage to undercut all the private companies, in my opinion, so they could control the transportation market, passenger transportation, and that's why overall I would say that Uber and Lyft is a negative. It's not as good of a job. And okay, so the other thing that I will give Uber and Lyft is that you don't have to deal with the money issue. like collecting money at the end of a taxi ride it took a lot of time, and it's pretty bothersome to have to do that. People would run out of the cab and steal from you, and there's really nothing you can do about it unless you can run them down, catch them, which I did one time. But most of the time you're just going to lose your money. They're not there. People just, you don't know who they are because there's no app or no rating system. It's just people jumping in your cab. They called, and so you don't even know if you did call the police who they are. And they usually get dropped off somewhere that's public. So anyway, you learn kind of who those people are, the sketchy ones that aren't going to pay. That's part of the job of a taxi driver. You learn not to give them rides. You learn to get the money up front. But not having to deal with the money is really nice part of Uber and Lyft. And the other part is that you can drive anytime you want and still make a profit. That's about it. Everything else I would say is negative. The other thing I want to touch upon is how people treat you, how people look at you. I feel like they don't have as much respect for Uber drivers. People just look at you like you're doing some kind of side hustle. They don't look at it like a profession. They don't look at it like a job, a professional. You're just Joe Schmo next door giving them a ride in your own car. So it's definitely, you get less respect. People used to be a lot more interested in the taxi. I used to drive, the taxi cab. It would be like an older car. It was just kind of beat up, 600,000 miles, 400,000 miles, and not like a luxury brand new car like people have to use now because of the higher expectations of younger people when it comes to getting an Uber or Lyft. They expect to have like this new car, nice car. Well, taxi cabs used to be, kind of older cars, and you'd have this meter on your dash, and you would click that thing on, and it would start counting the money. I don't know. People were just kind of interested in that. They didn't like the meter, but it was different, instead of just your smartphone. I will say that it's kind of easier driving people around in the smartphone era because they just look at their phone and they're not as needy. They don't really need your attention. So you don't have to kind of entertain people like it used to be. People used to get in and they didn't have a phone to look at, so they would be more interested in you and in the cab. And it's kind of nice that they, in one way, it's nice that they are just looking at their phone, most people, and kept busy for the ride. On the other hand, it's kind of weird that nobody really talks anymore as much. They're not as friendly. So I guess that's kind of a negative and a positive. The other negative thing is it's just strange for people to get in somebody's personal car, no matter how you cut it. Especially for women, they're pretty much like fearful, so they don't feel like they can trust the Uber driver, Lyft driver. So there's always this, like suspicion and fear that they have when they get in your car. And that's kind of a weird feeling and a situation that it wasn't like that when I was a taxi driver. People felt safe. you're driving in a uniformed car. You had a taxi license. You were hired by a company. You're accountable to supervisors. They say that the rating system and all that it protects you, but really you're just getting in some random car with somebody that has never done a drug test, has never been hired by anybody. They have no taxi license. So I think it is sketchy. It really is. And I think it is. If I was a woman, I would be suspicious or, somewhat fearful to get in somebody's car, a random guy's car. Generally it's a guy, men that are driving. The majority of drivers are men, and the women. There's some women that drive, and I don't think it's safe for women to be driving Uber and Lyft in these big cities at all. And that's just my opinion, but I think they're finding out as they get robbed and raped and shot, and those stories happen. It's not a safe job for women in the bigger cities, and I would say probably anywhere where there's a decent population of like 100,000 or more, because it's just especially if they're pretty and nice. If they're ugly and mean, they could probably get away with it, but it's not really a job, especially at nighttime, for women. And that's just the experience right there. It's one of the most difficult jobs I've ever done at nighttime. It's just crazy, and you get a lot of, most people are decent and respectful, but if you do it enough, you're going to get some crazy people, and dangerous, violent, all kinds of rude and perverse and everything else. So yeah, you definitely don't get paid enough to do Uber and Lyft at night. I would say it's like, I don't see how anybody does that. Okay, so here's the biggest problem I have with Uber and Lyft is that the centralization of the job, as in there's one company, or I guess two companies, in control of your job. So if somebody lies about you, says that you did something that you didn't, or they just complained, you can be deactivated for any reason at any time. And it doesn't have to be founded, it doesn't have to be true. It's just, some person doesn't like you, and they complain and lie about you, and then you're deactivated, and then your job's over. So it's not a real job because of that. The liability in that case, like giving people rides, you're basically rolling the dice every time for getting robbed, for getting murdered, and for people lying about you so you can be deactivated. And I would say, 90% of those things happen at nighttime. So I don't really think it's worth it for anybody to be driving Uber or Lyft at nighttime. Personally, I don't see why anybody would do that. I just do it during the daytime, and I do it along with food delivery. I prefer doing food delivery because there's less liability. There's less danger. It's easier, but there's just not enough orders in my area to just do food delivery. So I have been doing rides just to make more money. But the other part about, I guess this is the last thing that I'll touch upon is the insurance issue. With Uber and Lyft, they offer insurance while you're driving somebody. When you have somebody in your car and you get in a wreck, then they will cover, if it's your fault, they will cover the insurance with a $2,500 deductible for your car. But I guess if you're on a call and you're on the way there, they'll cover that too. But otherwise, they don't cover you. So, and there's also the problem of your own insurance. If you're driving around working and you get in a wreck when you're not on a call or you're not going towards a call, then you're not covered by Uber or Lyft. So you have to use your own insurance. And if they find out that you are doing Uber or Lyft, then they can drop your coverage and they can deny your claim. I don't know how they would find out unless you have stickers on your car. But if you have stickers on your car, which you're supposed to, and the police are there, then the police could put that in the report, or your insurance could find out, and then they could deny your claim, even for the other vehicle. Like if you're at fault. So there's all this liability when it comes to insurance. And that's how they got away with undercutting the taxi market, is by doing this, chintzy insurance crap. And it's also a reason why you shouldn't really do the job. It's why it's not a real job. You're supposed to contact your insurance and have this additional coverage called rideshare insurance. And so sometimes you got to pay like a couple $1,000s more every year just so you can be covered when you're not on a call. So it's just another expense. And it's really not worth it. If I was you, I wouldn't put any stickers on your car. And unless you have somebody in your car and you get in a wreck, I would not even claim it through Uber or Lyft. I would just claim through your own insurance, and do not tell them that you're driving for these companies, because the legality of it is all fuzzy. So it's just like, why would you pay another $100 a month or whatever for rideshare insurance? It's just a bogus issue. Like the companies should be paying for that, but that's So it's not a real job, because they can just deactivate you for no reason anytime. And especially when you're driving, like if you're just doing food delivery, there's a lot less of a chance of that happening, and you don't have to worry about getting in a wreck, because you can just claim it on your own insurance. But if you have somebody in your car that you're giving a ride, then you have to claim it through Uber or Lyft, because that person is likely going to tell the companies that that they got in a wreck. And so you basically have to use the Uber and Lyft insurance if you get in a wreck when you have somebody in your car. And you probably will lose your insurance coverage, and you'll have to pay a $2,500 deductible if it's your fault. Neither of these things were an issue when we were driving in a taxi, like a real taxi service. You did not have to worry about insurance, even if it was your fault. So that's a real bogus problem for this job, which They basically turned a job that used to be like a living wage job, mostly for men, and they've turned it into this sketchy side hustle, where people don't really respect you, and there's no security with the job. There's no there's no leverage that you have as a worker. You're just at the whim of these big corporations. They're tracking everything you do. You have to pay taxes. They know exactly how much you make. And that's the whole point of all this, is they want to control the passenger transport market. So overall, I would say it's a negative change. But there are some advantages to it for the passenger and the driver, but they don't outweigh the negatives. And that's my take on Uber and Lyft versus a traditional taxi cab company. Hope this helps in your ride share efforts. Definitely don't count on it as a real job, because it's not.